Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Hey everybody, welcome to your weekly debrief. This is our weekly deep breath when it comes to the news. And I don't know about you, but I could really use a deep breath this week for a few different reasons. Just as we were starting this, what usually is a live broadcast, we realized that platform on Instagram wasn't working, and it took about 30 minutes to realize that's never going to work for us. And so this is a great opportunity for us to double down on making sure that this podcast and this video is available elsewhere. It's a great reminder that you have to have backups upon backups upon backups. And so I'm going to try to take that as a blessing instead of being frustrated, because this is really the only time in the week, Thursday morning, that I have a quiet household. And I love sharing that quiet household with you. It actually makes me super happy. I love putting together this weekly debrief. And as you know, Smarter News is always dedicated to quick, concise, nonpartisan information. But we do need these moments where we can take a deep breath and we can look at the news with a little bit more of a critical eye. And one of the things I've seen this week with the news that's been frustrating to me as a journalist is that news cycles like this give us an incredible opportunity to really fill in some missing pieces of news stories, to take a deep breath and do that so that we can all learn together. We're really experiencing in so many different ways, on so many different topics, living history that's changing the course of the country, or how we're seeing not only policies in place, but law. I don't want to get too far ahead, but there's obviously a lot of big themes to dig in here. And I'm excited about doing this with you. I have a couple different special items that I want to share. And I'm really going to be focusing this week on the news driver of the week, which is this leak from the Supreme Court, an unprecedented historic leak from the Supreme Court that has been confirmed by the court, which makes me a little bit more comfortable talking about it. We know that this is not the final decision on what already was a historic case for the court to consider, which is a case that was based about a situation in Mississippi, which we'll talk a little bit about. We already knew that the court was going to confront this issue. We just expected to get more information on it a couple weeks from now in June, early July, when we typically see court decisions. So we get this leak from the Supreme Court that is giving us, in some capacity, although we don't know how much, some insight into perhaps how the court is thinking. Although you can hear my language, right? I feel uncomfortable with this because I have a lot of questions ethically about reporting on leaked information, really of any kind, coming from anyone. Because in a news cycle, when the news cycle is built strictly around a leak, then it's a news cycle that's been manufactured. And it's been produced by someone intentionally. And I like news that we can look at as news is evolving. Many times stories are developing in I don't want to say a natural way, because obviously different people are weighing in on stories, they're changing all the time. But when you know that there is a leak, a purposeful leak, and let's be clear, this leak is happening the first Monday in May. It's happening on the same week as Mother's Day. It's happening before the summer break for Congress. It's happening when people are engaged. We've talked about when news stories explode. You know, there's news stories at the end of the week when you see people wanting to bury the news intentionally. Well, when a leak happens on Monday night, that's on purpose to drive the news. And I don't really have any more insight into how Politico attained this leak from the Supreme Court, which is a draft decision on this Mississippi case that could impact current abortion law as we know it in America. Based on the draft and the leak, it looks like it will. But there's still a level of anxiety for me on that because it's not the final decision. And that's something that the Supreme Court emphasized in their own statement about this, which is this is not the final decision. It does not represent the court basically in its totality. And by the way, when you get a decision, this is also really important, and I think sort of missing from all of this. When we do get a decision on any number of cases that the Supreme Court is seeing, you not only get the decision of the majority, but you have the dissenting opinion of the minority. And when you have both, that's what we love, right? We have both sides. We have both perspectives at the same time to look through. We don't have that here. And so this there's a lot of missing pieces. And so missing pieces is a little bit of the theme for this week's debrief. So what I want to do is I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to start off with a story. I'm going to start off with a story for you that is seeped in history, but even looking at it, I thought, there's some interesting threads here to pull to kind of tie into some of the themes of this week's story. And then I want to talk to you about 3 things about current abortion law and coverage in America that is missing on a regular basis. And that I think if we can do a better job filling in some of these missing pieces by doing better reporting, then we can serve you better. And that's what really good, healthy, free press is doing, is providing a service. And that my hope for you is that you can listen to this debrief, you can watch this debrief, and whatever you're feeling, because there's a lot of complicated emotions around the issues that we're going to be talking about, it provides something extra, something that you wouldn't normally get from the regular news cycle. I've been doing a lot of listening this week. I've been listening to everybody. My phone is full of podcasts from different people on this issue. I'm reading all the newspapers, watching a little news, which even for someone who worked on broadcast television, it's not something I do very often, but I was curious about it. And so I think at this point I've done my listening and now I'm ready to do a little talking. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for that. So let's start off with this story. Let me tell you a story. So back at the beginning of Mother's Day, when Mother's Day became an actual holiday, a national holiday, Woodrow Wilson issued a declaration on it. And the way that Mother's Day was going to be celebrated was through hanging American flags. So as you see a lot of advertisements for Mother's Day going into this weekend, I want you to remember that there was at the beginning a tradition that this is not just a holiday about celebrating mothers, but patriotism and the American mother. The woman that's thought to be behind this holiday is a woman named Anna Jarvis, and she was inspired by her mother. And listen to what her mother did. Her mother was really focused on bringing people together from different sides, especially after the Civil War. You had the Union side, the Confederates, and you can imagine after the Civil War, the most devastating war in American history as far as fatalities. How do you knit the two sides together? She was focused on Appalachia, in the Appalachia area. And so this was in particular sort of a poorer area of the nation as it was. And you had people that could be in similar areas fighting for opposite sides. So she decided that she was going to start sort of these clubs that were going to focus on health and sanitation and try to bring communities back together. And so Anna Jarvis thought that my mother's incredible. Look at what she's doing for her community. And she was inspired to try to get Mother's Day, a celebration of mothers, just one day on the calendar. And that tradition started on a state level. I believe it was Virginia that started it initially. And sometimes, by the way, in American history, we could look at Memorial Day, for example, different states were doing something similar at similar times. So it's sometimes difficult to say this one state was, that was the trailblazer when it came to Mother's Day. But it did start at a state level, and eventually it went to a national level where Mother's Day is recognized. And the reason why I think that this is an interesting story on a few different levels is that it really talks to us about the importance of motherhood, how powerful mothers can be. There is a focus on a little bit about state versus the national, what people are doing on a community level versus what they're doing on a national level, how that might look different. And also a focus on trying to knit together political divisiveness at a very intense level. All of that having root in Mother's Day. I've often heard that mothers and women set the tone for a community. And I've thought about that periodically over the years about whether or not I'm doing that correctly or in a healthy way for my family or for my community. But I find a lot of truth in that too. And so I'm going to think a little bit about that on Mother's Day. And like I said, you're looking at this story from the Supreme Court that depending on how you look, and remember, it's a kaleidoscope. We're all looking at a story almost through a kaleidoscope. And when you kind of turn that kaleidoscope, you might get a little different picture of the story. And really when the news works, it enables us to turn that kaleidoscope to see what other people may be seeing or feeling. And so in some cases, this story, when we look at abortion law, which deals with pregnancy, for some people, it also is closely tied to motherhood. For other people, it's not at all. And there's a dividing line between that. We're going to talk a little bit about public opinion and what's assumed about public opinion. I found something really interesting in the New York Times about that. So let's kind of dive into this issue. This is what everybody's talking about. While I am uncomfortable with being driven by a leak and being forced to talk about something because of that, this is also what everyone's talking about. And so I want to just spend a little time on this today. So let's just dig in before we get into any specifics about, the Supreme Court leak itself. And by the way, I've looked at the draft decision, but I'm even holding myself back a little bit because if it's not the final decision, I want all my energy to go there to really dissect that for you. So I want to start on a really kind of big level for you today. I think a lot of us believe that we know something about history and about law. I know I do. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you read something and you realize you knew nothing about it at all, that some of your assumptions about the past were actually not correct. And if those assumptions maybe were different, then you would look at the news in a different way. And so let me give you an example of that, because I think there's something that's really missing when it comes to the discussion about Roe v. Wade. The law that we talk about as fundamentally setting up the constitutional framework, the legal framework, the constitutional right to an abortion. We talk about Roe v. Wade like it is a statute or a code or, a policy, but we have to remember that Roe v. Wade established a right to an abortion through a Supreme Court precedent. So it's not codified or codified, depending on how you say that word, by law. There's no federal law that we could point to or statute that is saying this is abortion law in America. No, the law is based on the Supreme Court decision. And that's one of the functions of the Supreme Court, is that the Supreme Court has the final say when it comes to constitutional issues. It's set up for that. That's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court exists. So a Supreme Court decision on the case Roe v. Wade established abortion law in America and provided a further legal framework to work within. And let me explain that a little bit more. Because although Roe v. Wade established a legal framework and a federal constitutional right to an abortion, it did so for a certain period of the pregnancy. It did so with limits. So this idea that Roe v. Wade is a law of some sort that was passed through legislation through Congress, that's not true. We know this is a Supreme Court decision. We also know that this idea that abortion access is unfettered at any point in the pregnancy wherever you live is also not current law. That hasn't been the current law for 50 years, because one of the things Roe v. Wade did is, yes, it said there's a federal constitutional right to an abortion during a certain period in the pregnancy, and then deferred to the states for further parameters on that. And states have done different things. So states over the course of the last several decades have set up their own laws through elected officials. And sometimes, when we're seeing these laws challenged on a state level, then you have courts getting involved. But elected officials are passing laws that are operating, they believe, within the legal framework of Roe v. Wade. Some of the states are expanding access to abortion or trying to secure it, no matter what happens from any sort of decision by the Supreme Court or federal law or otherwise. Then you have other states that are looking to restrict access to abortion. And it's that those states that are really challenging when a state can step in and do this, which is why we have another case winding up at the Supreme Court. You see, Roe v. Wade actually set up the structure, and not necessarily anticipating this, but that states were going to do their own, they were going to write their own story at a certain point in the pregnancy when it came to access to an abortion. And then we have several states that have pushed up against what some consider legal. And that's why you have these state laws being challenged by some that are saying, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that, Texas. That's not constitutional. You can't do that, Mississippi. That's not constitutional. And then you have the other side say, okay, well, try to stop me. Let's go to court. And this is why we wind up in the Supreme Court with this issue again. It's not very, typical. When we see a Supreme Court, I shouldn't say it's not typical. The Supreme Court constantly is evaluating whether some existing law is constitutional or how the Constitution applies to current situations. This is the exercise of the Supreme Court to figure that out. But how often does the Supreme Court grant a constitutional right and then retract it? How often does that happen? Because there was the constitutional right to an abortion, still is, by the way, depending on this decision. There was a constitutional right to an abortion for all American citizens based on Roe v. Wade. How often would you be granted a right, a constitutional right, affirm that right, and then taken away and deferred back to the states? How often does that happen? Not very often. And this is one of the reasons why what we're watching in this particular case, based on a case in Mississippi, is important, because oftentimes, according to tradition in the Supreme Court, the justices will defer to past precedent. So they'll say, this is our interpretation of the Constitution, how it applies to this case today, but we're also considering the past precedent of justices that came before us. And so if the decision by the Supreme Court somehow overruled Roe v. Wade, which is what this leak would indicate, although it's not final, then that would not only be a new way of looking at constitutional right, but it would also be overruling past precedent. And that's why you're hearing some say, well, if this goes, then anything else can go. And that is an argument that you may hear. You're going to also hear another argument that's a slippery slope, that you can't just say because Roe v. Wade, there would be a different interpretation of it, and that abortion rights and access would go back to the states. That would mean the same for other really emotional political topics. You could pick any number of them and say, oh, well, the Supreme Court's going to overrule all of that. I think that's the other part of this news coverage that we have to be very clear about. Again, a lot of different opinions about where the federal government, the role of the federal government, and the role of your state and your community. We've talked a lot about this because all of those things are somehow in tension to each other. There's a tension between those. And that's why we live in the United States of America, where there's not a monarchy or royalty making one overarching rule that's staying into effect for hundreds of years. You have a lot of change in politics on all of these levels, right? Not just among elected officials. And then you have this question of, where does your personal liberty fit into that? How does your personal liberty fit into what your community says, what your state says, what the federal government says? And in some cases, and if we go back to the beginning of America, the founding, we have to remember that really up until the Civil War, the concept of the states being the leaders and the federal government being weak, by the way, weak and with like very little money, the states were really these powerful pillars. The changing role of the federal government is an interesting story, because a lot of American citizens now turn to the federal government for direction, where in other past decades, you may turn to your state for direction, and your identity would be more, I'm a Californian and I'm an American, where based on kind of how I see the news playing out, the way that I think we think about our framework now, we have a really big federal government, and that's not always the case in America. And so that's a question about where is the role of the federal government. So this idea of Roe v. Wade being overruled instantly insinuates that there would be no access to abortion in America in some circles, right? It's going to start a domino effect that's going to lead to that. What this would do is defer back to the states. And then you have states that have different laws, and those different laws would create different situations for the citizens that live there. And so here, that's what I think is really important about Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade set up the legal precedent, set up the legal framework. It set up the law for abortion. And it did so with the states having a role. And so that could be something that we eventually see again, where the state's role is bigger than the federal government. So you might say to me, well, wait a minute, what about elected officials, passing a law? Like, what about a federal law? And that's something that Congress has attempted. The House of Representatives, for example, has attempted something to the effect that would protect abortion access or abortion rights, depending on the words that you use. And again, word choice is very important here. You're going to have to excuse me, because I think at any point I could trip into something that I want to clarify. But yes, Congress has taken up this issue. It did not, and they did so recently within the last year. going back over the last year. The House passed some legislation to that effect. The Senate didn't go anywhere. And while senators now are talking about the idea that some sort of legislation could be passed or go into effect, that remains to be determined. It's not only a question about political will, it's also about practicality and the rules of the Senate and what that will actually look like. So that's something to watch. But even if a law is passed, so for example, the healthcare law was passed by a Democrat majority, right? The healthcare law during President Obama's administration was passed, but you saw what happened. Just because legislators, the elected officials, pass a law into legislation, that doesn't mean it won't go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would then have to decide again whether or not it was within the power of the federal government to set up such a law. And so this is, again, why this decision matters so much. By the way, what is this decision, this case in Mississippi? Just quickly, Mississippi has been a state that has, in the past, restricted access to abortion. And interesting, just an idea of how quickly the news has changed, up until a certain point, had the most restrictive rules when it came to abortion, fewest abortion clinics, right? And it was looking to ban abortion more or less after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Now you have Texas and Oklahoma that have attempted new laws that would effectively do that after 6 weeks. You have other laws that are into effect, restrictive laws that would ban abortion after the heartbeat was detected, which is more or less what the Mississippi law was about. So this is where the challenge was. Mississippi did this, and then you had those that said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that because it's undue burden on a woman, and there's all these reasons you can't do that, Mississippi, and here we are at the Supreme Court. So we've been watching this case for several years. So how does the American public feel about abortion? You've heard that a lot probably over the last couple of days too, about how the Supreme Court, in whatever their decision is, could be marching in step or against political will of the public. But remember, the Supreme Court is not elected, and they're supposed to really honor the Constitution. That's their focus, not necessarily the will of the people, right? They're supposed to take a look at the case in front of them and make a ruling. And so you may have heard repeated references, because I have, that, in general, the American public is for more access to abortion, not less, or for protection about access to abortion, not less. And so I was looking at something from the New York Times that was really weighing in on this, and I read this paragraph, and I want to read it to you because I think this is really fascinating, because you're going to hear people say that, hey, this is out of step with the American public. You've heard this, right? Well, guess what? It's very difficult to measure political opinion of the American public on this topic. This is something I learned this week. So let me read this to you. New York Times. A New York Times article that's, by the way, really focused on polling. I don't really focus on polling a lot at Smarter News. You probably have seen that. I don't chase it, because polling is a snapshot of the past. And so it's helpful in reporting a story, but not something I ever want to place too much weight on, because it's backwards looking, and we always want to be like, how the story is evolving, what is it developing? So let me read you this paragraph, New York Times, okay? The public's views on abortion are notoriously hard to measure, with large segments of the public often seeming to offer muddled or inconsistent answers. Polls consistently show that around 2/3 of Americans support the court's decision in Roe v. Wade and oppose overturning it. Yet just as many Americans say they support banning abortion in the second trimester, a step barred by Roe. And a more modest majority, usually around 55% in broader sets of data, supports legal abortion in most or all cases, while people split almost evenly over whether they consider themselves pro-choice or pro-life. So you might listen to that and say, okay, what does that mean, right? I think the biggest takeaway is that it's very difficult for people to measure on this. Like, what is the overarching public opinion? For example, if most Americans support the court's decision in Roe v. Wade, does that mean most Americans support the ability of states to make additional laws or put additional parameters on abortion? Or is the American public thinking that Roe v. Wade offers unfettered access to abortion? So what is the American public's really understanding of current law, and can we actually pull on that? I don't know the answer to that, but I thought this was really interesting. So when people say, on either side, say assumptions about how people feel on this issue, I think you could say, well, I was listening to Smarter News, and by the way, the New York Times did something on that. And, it's a little bit difficult to anticipate that. And we know that probably in our own private conversations that there's a lot of nuance, how one would look at this issue, what sort of exceptions would be part of this, what this would mean in practicality. What does this mean with medical technology? You might see additional articles coming out in the next coming weeks, anticipation of this decision, this final decision from the Supreme Court. Now it's less about the procedure and now about abortion pills, about medication. And so these stories are constantly changing, right? So I think that's important to know, that we have to be careful about the assumptions that we're making about the public. And here's something else that's interesting, and this is the final point on this issue. Oftentimes when we're doing the play-by-play of politics or the court or what states are doing, these seem like larger than life entities that are separated from our life. But we have to remember that every different division that I just mentioned, every branch of government, whether it's the executive, the legislative, the judicial, whether it's federal or state or even more local in your community, the people that are in power are there because of us. And you might say, well, yeah, I didn't elect a Supreme Court justice, Jenna. And I'll say, yeah, you didn't, but America elected a president, and the president has that power. And it's just a reminder of why participating in elections matter. Because participating in presidential elections really isn't just about that president. It's about what potentially could happen to the Supreme Court. Because we know that people serve very different timelines. That's something I found myself reflecting on a lot this week. We know that presidential terms versus terms in the House of Representatives versus terms in the Senate, they're all different lengths. And the founders did that on purpose, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to give the House of Representatives, for example, that everyone's elected every 2 years. They wanted that to really reflect the fomenting change of the American public, right? You don't do what the political will of your constituents, you're out, buddy, and somebody else is in. The Senate was supposed to be a little bit more stable part of the legislative branch. People are elected every 6 years. So there's more of a stability there with those lawmakers. And there's only 2 from every state, for example. We know that presidential terms are 4 years. And we know that the Supreme Court, for the most part, is a lifetime tenure for a justice. So whoever we've seen nominated, let's take 2, Amy Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson, the likelihood is that we're going to see and hear from them for decades. Way longer than any of the elected officials that we're talking about right now. And this is a reminder about why you really matter to the system. It also sets up very interesting storylines that I think is also important. Let me give you an example. State of Georgia. The state of Georgia also, and forgive me, I don't know exactly what stage they are with abortion law there. They're one of the states that has moved or will move or is attempting to restrict abortion access, more similar to states that are around them. And so you look at a state of Georgia, and we know that the state of Georgia was very important in electing President Joe Biden to the presidency. Georgia broke blue, and so that was really important in the presidential election. You have 2 senators from Georgia that are Democrat, but the state government is majority Republican. And these are the people that Georgians have elected. So what Georgia looks like as far as politics on a federal level looks different than it looks at a state level. And our system creates that opportunity. It's not without consequences. So depending on how you vote in Georgia and how you feel on this issue, you could be feeling a lot of different emotions today. And that's sort of the brilliance of the American system, to be flexible and to change with the political will of the public. But when I'm watching the press report this story, when I'm watching journalism in general, one of the pieces that's very missing, again, going back to the missing pieces in all of this, is we do not remind you how powerful you are on a regular basis. You're very powerful. You're very powerful as an individual. Your vote has consequences that can last decades, hundreds of years, because of you, because of your vote and how you're voting. Your dollar, how you're spending it, has global impact. And it's really important, especially during this time where we're examining, well, what does liberty look like? What does freedom really look like? Who grants me my freedom? Or do I? Do I get to forge my own path to freedom? All of these things have come up over the last couple of years. I'm thinking, for example, on pandemic policy in particular with that. What does it look like to be free? What do I have to wear to be free? Even something like a mask has challenged us on that. And so now we're seeing it on an issue that really hits people just deeply in their heart, which is the issue of abortion. And we're asking those same questions. What does personal liberty really look like? Who grants me that liberty or doesn't grant me that liberty? Who's the most important voice on that issue? Do I need the federal government to weigh in on that? Or do I need my state? And for someone in, let's say, the state of Texas that doesn't like the current abortion law, is that enough for them to move to a different state? Because in America, you can do that. You can change where you live based on that. Could we see that? Could we see, is this a big enough issue to really create change like that? And we'll see, we'll see. Conjecture is when you're reaching a conclusion based on incomplete information. And so I want to be very careful with conjecture because there's been a lot of it. And I think you've had enough of it for this week. So I'm not going to further kind of hypothesize what happens if Roe v. Wade is struck down by the Supreme Court decision. Let's wait and see. Let's see what actually the justices say. And then let's equally pay enough attention to what any dissenting opinion would be, because that will also enrich the conversation that we can have on this topic. And we want a more complete story. We want to report a nuanced, interesting, complete story on this. We owe it to each other to do that. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments, because the more that we can serve you, as questions come up, I don't want you to be afraid to ask questions. Please ask us questions. It helps us with our reporting and making sure that we're really focused on the things that matter for you. And if you're curious about something, I'm probably curious about it too. And I love curiosity. I think curiosity is the ultimate expression of freedom, because it's our freedom of thinking creatively and differently and asking questions and wondering. That's a real exercise of liberty. So thank you for being here. Curiosity over commentary is our mantra, and we're going to have more quick, concise, nonpartisan information, of course, on smarternews.com. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.